Aloha everyone, and welcome to another episode of Sincerely Alana. On today's episode, I am going to be talking about some basic terminology to use when discussing race, and also explaining the difference between certain terms that are often misconstrued or believed to be synonymous with each other. I'm sure a lot of you guys know what's been going on with the Black Lives Matter movement, and if you don't know exactly what's been going on, I will describe some of it in later videos. Today though, I just wanted to give you guys some basic terminology to use when discussing and having these very sensitive conversations about what exactly race is and how to combat racism. I know a lot of people confuse racism with prejudice and discrimination, so I really wanted to describe what racism is and how racism has changed over the course of our history. Racism kind of has two parts to its definition. The first is that it's the belief that races are populations whose physical differences are linked to significant social and cultural differences within a hierarchy. The second part of this is racism is the practice of subordinating races who are believed to be inferior. So one thing that I think is very prevalent in both of these definitions is racism assumes that one race is better than another. So old racism is basically like the overt expressions of racism toward a person or group of people. How people were literally grabbing Black people off the streets and lynching them. Like, those are obviously racist acts, and that's what people today still attribute with racism. However, new racism includes less explicit forms of racism, which are incorporated into daily practices. So one example of this would be colorblindness, also microaggressions. Another difference that I wanted to explain to you guys is the difference between race and ethnicity. So ethnicity is a term that you can give yourself that defines who you are culturally. So some group identities are based on notions of similar and shared history, culture, religiosity, and kinship. Whereas race oftentimes is solely based off of your physical appearance or the color of your skin. Yeah, it's kind of tricky. Obviously there are similarities and some overlap. Some of the similarities include the fact that race and ethnicity share an ideology of common ancestry, and both are socially constructed. So let's touch on that really fast. Race is made up. There are no such thing as separate human races. We are all one race, the human race. Just because the color of our skin is different does not mean that we are some type of subspecies that are completely different from each other. In fact, there is more variation within a population of a racial group than there is in between racial categories. So in your genes, biologically, you are more similar to somebody. You can be more similar to somebody who is a different race than you are than somebody within your own race. So both race and ethnicity are socially constructed. They are things that we assign to ourselves or assign to others. Ethnicity is something that you usually claim for yourself, while race is something that usually people give to you or associate you as. What I believe to be the fundamental difference is that race is socially imposed and hierarchical. The hierarchy part. Race is something that others assign to you based on the color of your skin. Your ethnicity is what you identify with culturally within a certain group, and your nationality is where you have your citizenship from. So strangers could say that my race is white, or that I'm a brown girl, or that I'm Mexican. My ethnicity is Hawaiian, along with some other things, but I mostly identify with my Hawaiian ethnicity. And my nationality would be American because I was born and raised in the US, and I do not have any dual citizenship anywhere else. Microaggressions are daily commonplace insults and racial slights that cumulatively affect the psychological well-being of people of color. So like I said, that's the practice of utilizing stereotypes, making really just inappropriate comments that don't need to be said, like, oh, you're pretty for a Black girl, oh, you must be smart because you're Asian. Like, those things just really aren't necessary. And microaggressions are also a form of discrimination. So discrimination is the practice of treating people differently based on the color of their skin, based on their race. Prejudice, on the other hand, is judgment. Prejudice, to me, when I think of prejudice, the first thing I think of is judgment. That's the number one thing. Prejudice is just having judgment, thinking things, believing things even though you have no idea who that person is. You have no idea, you probably haven't even had close relationships with anybody within a certain race that you have prejudice against. I will say this though, when having a lot of conversations, I've told my family this, because sometimes, you know, it is hard. It's hard to figure out what these differences are. And so a lot of people would confuse prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice are the thoughts and beliefs that are within a person that holds on to judgment. Discrimination is how you act based off of your prejudice. Now, prejudice and racism are two different things. Racism has the innate system of inequality within it, believing that one is better than the other. Prejudice is very similar, but what I would like to point out as the main difference is that racism is imposed and practiced by and effective by the people who are in the dominant position within society. Anybody can have prejudice, but not everybody can practice racism, because the effects of racism aren't as damaging or impactful as it is to people of color. Racial ideology is a set of principles and ideas that, one, divides people into different racial groups, and two, serves the interests of one group. So ideologies are usually created by the dominant group and will reflect the interest of that group. But racial ideology, typically within the history of the United States, has been created and maintained by the dominant Euro-American society, white society. Theories of racism, the three that I'm going to talk about today, are biological racism, cultural racism, and colorblindness. Biological racism is the idea that whites are genetically superior to non-whites. This has its origin in scientific racism. This idea has its origin in the 19th century and basically set out to try to prove scientifically that whites are superior and have innate intelligence. Please look into how they tried to conduct scientific proof that the races were in a hierarchy. A lot of the stuff I have read, you know, everything that I've read about scientific racism basically has been off of inaccurate and false measurements. Craniometry, the measuring of the skull, was used to try to prove that whites were innate to people of color. I forget the scientist who did this, but basically he would measure the skulls of grown white men and compare them to the measurements of skulls from women of color or children who are younger in age. So obviously, men and women are smaller. That's biologically true. Biologically, men and women are different. They're smaller in size, women are smaller in size, more petite. So measuring and just comparing those two makes absolutely no sense, and they knew this and they did it on purpose, just to try to prove that one race is better than the other, and it doesn't make any sense. Anyways, so cultural racism is a way of thinking that attributes disadvantaged racial groups' lack of prosperity to their behavior and culture, instead of thinking about how their structural factors have influenced them. An example of this is saying that poverty within the Black community is a result of dysfunctional Black families, instead of the fact that we have been redlining Black communities, we have been systemic racism. I'll get into that. So the third and final theory of racism that I will be discussing is colorblind racism, and this is the idea that we should ignore skin color completely. Again, this is a textbook definition. Colorblind racism provides the best framework for shaping a world without racial discrimination, but scholars and a lot of people of color argue that ignoring skin color won't make inequalities based on skin color disappear. Instead, this is just reinforcing all the issues and all the racial ideologies that have already been in place. It does nothing to benefit, uplift, or make our society equal. Another really important topic when discussing race and racism is colorism. I'm not going to get too much into that just because I did an entire video about it in season 2 with my good friend Courtney Dixon, and so yeah, I'm not going to get too much into it, but colorism is basically that the idea that within races, lighter skin is better. And what's unfortunate and how it ties to racism and systemic racism is within skin color stratification. So skin color stratification is a system in which resources such as income and status are distributed unequally according to skin color. Historically, skin color stratification was very prevalent during slavery, with lighter skinned people being more likely to work within the house compared to darker skinned people who were forced to work in the fields and were not taught to read or offered to be freed. Lighter skinned people were often given some type of education and were usually, you know, had a promise, or people would say that they would later free them. I wanted to go over majority versus minority responses, and these still happen today. However, a lot of these things have happened historically, especially when we talk about majority responses, but minority responses occur every single day. The last couple definitions about majority responses do as well. So without further ado, regarding the majority, there are several ways that they have dealt with minority groups. The first and most extreme is extermination, and this refers to genocide and the ethnic cleansing of a region. So the main example that I can give you guys is the Holocaust, and another example is the genocide in Rwanda, and that included the mass slaughter of 500,000 ethnic minority Tutsis, I hope I'm saying these right, by the majority Hutus in 1994. So these things are very recent. A second response that the majority has done to the minority includes expulsion, which is forcing a minority group to leave an area. U.S. history, Trail of Tears, that's an example. Segregation, which refers to the physical separation of two groups in residence, workplace, and social functions or environments. Again, U.S., the American South, segregation. We had segregation for a very long time happening within the U.S. and the best way, I think the best thing for you guys to look up when thinking about segregation would be Jim Crow laws. Final response that we talk about when it comes to majorities responding to minorities is acceptance, and there are 3 levels to acceptance of minorities by the majority. One is assimilation, which is when minorities are permitted to acquire the traits of the dominant group. That means that they are not strictly segregated nor discriminated against as a matter of policy. Next is pluralism, which is when minorities are permitted to express their own culture without a great deal of prejudice or discrimination. And finally, you have fusion, which is when minorities are accepted fully and a new group identity is created, as in the melting pot metaphor. An example of fusion occurs when intermarriage happens, or exogamy, and this is an element that reflects the fusion of groups to the fullest extent. So with the minority responses to the majority, there are 3 ways to deal with subordination and injustice, and these include pass, exit, and voice. Regarding minority groups, pass captures the processes of assimilation and acculturation. So in order to assimilate, it is necessary to learn the repertoire of behaviors and all that, the ways of the dominant group. So to pass, this depends on one's willingness to change in order to adopt the new dominant group's views or practices, but it also depends on the willingness of the majority to accept you. The second response to the majority for minorities is exit, and this is a strategy of withdrawal, where example in the United States was the Great Migration during the time of the Jim Crow South. And this is where there was just a mass exit of African Americans leaving the South and escaping to northern cities to escape repression, basically. Also a variation of an exit strategy in which a minority group, usually within a geographical region, seeks to create its own country. So thinking back to my Spain trip, the example of Catalonia or Catalan is a perfect example of secession, because they are still within the region, but they have chosen to try to fight to create their own country, to be separate from the majority who often oppresses and discriminates against them. So finally, the last response of minorities to the majority is voice, and this refers to refusing to accept minority group status and organizing collectively to challenge subordination by the majority. And usually this is through a social or political movement. So currently what we're experiencing with the Black Lives Matter movement is a great example, and it definitely ties in with the most significant movement in US history, which is the African American Civil Rights Movement. There are also the Mexican American movement, the American Indian movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement. I mean, there are just so many ways and examples in history where we've seen voice being used and the push for policy reform being recognized, and voice is effective. It's hard. Voice is definitely the more dangerous of the three responses because you're trying to mobilize a large group and you're putting a target on your back, basically, because of challenging the status quo, trying to fight the system. Like, they're just, it's dangerous. Having a voice is dangerous, but without voice we would see no change and there would be even greater inequality within the world. To wrap this video up, there are two more terms that I want to talk to you guys about, and they are systemic racism and structural racism. So I'll start with structural racism. So yes, structural racism. Structural racism is the interinstitutional interactions across time and space. So that's a pretty broad definition, but some examples to give you includes racial inequality in housing, which leads to racial inequality in schooling, which in turn leads to racial inequality in the labor market. So it's, to me, structural racism is a cycle. How one impacts the other. So if somebody is in a poor neighborhood, they're going to be in a poor school district, and if they're in a poor school district or they don't have the education to get them to higher education or to more elite universities, then they're not going to make as much money. Wealth inequality has been structured into so many generations and so many systemic barriers that have hampered, for example, African Americans throughout time. I use African Americans because this is the most obvious, clear, blatant abuse of power that has prohibited them from gaining wealth, from maintaining wealth, from prospering the way that we should all be prospering in the US if we are the land of the free. These barriers that dampen or prohibit people from experiencing wealth inequality for the Black community include slavery, Jim Crow laws, institutionalized racism, and even today we still have voter suppression, which prohibits us from voting people that we believe would make a difference in the community. Finally, we have systemic racism. Systemic racism exists because of the history of the US as a slaveholding nation, and is present because of how deeply racial oppression has been ingrained into the foundation of the US. The rationalization of racial oppression is also within systemic racism. You also have an imbalance of power where whites reproduce inequality through control of political and economic resources, and it's the pervasiveness of everyday acts of discrimination combined with the legacy of unequal distribution of resources throughout every aspect of US society that constitutes systemic racism. So yes, that's it for today's video. I hope you found it helpful. Quick review of what we went over today was racism, prejudice, discrimination, old racism versus new racism. We talked about racial ideologies. We also discussed 3 theories of racism and went into the different definitions regarding majority versus minority responses. And finally, we discussed systemic versus structural racism. I hope you guys found this video helpful. If I misspoke on anything, or if there's something that you would like to add or correct me on, please feel free to leave it in the comments, reach out to me directly. I do not know everything there is to know about this stuff, and this is just based off of my research, what I've learned within my classes and within my conversations with other advocates and people in the community. So take it easy on me. I'm really just trying to help spread what I know. And I really hope that what you learned today will help you have productive conversations when it comes to race, racism, and the current climate that we're living in today. So with that being said, be sure to spread peace, love, and positivity. Mahalo.